Alright, so continuing our discussion of the modern history of China, uh, when Mao Zedong started the Cultural Revolution, he needed he needed a strong force to go out and to do his bidding, to do what he wanted, which was to bring about revolutionary change in the country. And what he did was he enlisted this group called the Red Guard, and these were absolutely fanatic communists, people who absolutely bought into the idea of communism. And the group that he chose for this was young people. We're talking 15 to 25-year-olds, young adults. The reason he chose them is because these people were obviously, first and foremost, old enough to take any action. And at the same time, they had only known communism in China. They were not old enough to remember the way that things were, maybe during the Civil War or before the Civil War, during the time of the Emperor. So they had only known communism, so they were more likely to believe that it was the only way of doing things and the best way of doing things. So these 15 to 25-year-olds went out and did all of these terrible acts. They were the ones who destroyed the churches. They're the ones who destroyed the relics, destroyed the synagogues and the temples. They were the ones who shut down the schools. They were the people that beat and forced their former teachers and former neighbors and friends into work camps, and sometimes executed and killed them. So it was basically brainwash. If you look down at the quote we have right here by a former member of the Red Guard, looking back on it, he admits, yeah, we were probably brainwashed. We didn't really know what we were doing. We weren't really thinking for ourselves. We were doing what our master wanted us to do without putting much thought into it. And like I said, the reason they did that because they didn't know any better. They had been programmed from day one to believe that communism was the greatest system in the world, and it was the only way to run a country, and it was the best way to run a country, and that their leader, Mao Zedong, was the greatest person in the world, and whatever he said had to be right. So they went out and they did these terrible atrocities. So that generation, that whole 10-year span of young adults, men, women in China are considered the lost generation because they missed out on a proper education. Their education was communism. Their education was worshiping and memorizing the words of Mao Zedong and going out and doing his will. They had no skills. They had no education, and they suffered it after the Cultural Revolution. After that fanaticism, that radicalism was kind of washed up, they really had a very low outlook in terms of what they could do thereafter. They had no skills, they had no education, so that's why they're called the lost generation. All right, eventually this madness ended. All right, it didn't happen until Mao Zedong actually passed away, and his successor, Zhang Xiaoping, took over. All right, he realized that this radical cultural revolution was a little too much. It wasn't sustainable. It wasn't good for China. It was absurd. He actually was targeted by people in the Cultural Revolution, the group known as the Gang of Four. They targeted him and wanted him out of the country because they knew that he opposed their ideas. Luckily for China, he was able to gain power over the Gang of Four and became leader of China after Mao Zedong's death. He brought about a series of economic reforms, moved away from that command economy, moved away from that government planning everything. He invited in private businesses, or I'm sorry, he encouraged private business. He encouraged international trade. He encouraged people to, or I'm sorry, outside countries to invest in China. He kind of opened up the economy. Now, they didn't become a complete free market economy overnight, and they still are very, very far from a free market economy, but they're certainly much freer, and there's much more private ownership and private business in China than there was during the time of Mao Zedong. So things were going pretty good in China, at least better than they were under Mao, but people still felt repressed. The economy had been made a little freer, but the government hadn't. The government was still run by one group of people, one group of like-minded people, an oligarchy, if you will. the Communist Party, the CPC, the Communist Party of China, were the only people in power. That would be the equivalent of only having a Republican Party and only being able to vote for Republicans, or only having a Democratic Party and only being able to vote for Democrats. They really had no say in the government structure. It was this group of people who were able to gain power in the Communist Party decided everything that happened in the country. Well, eventually the people got kind of sick of this, and it came to a head during an incident called the Tiananmen Square Massacre. What happened was a pro-democracy leader died in China. So pro-democracy, or Chinese citizens who were in favor of democracy, gathered in Beijing. They gathered in a place called Tiananmen Square, and they mourned the death of this great leader. Well, eventually that mourning turned into a sort of protest. They decided to stay, and they said, hey, we need to push for democracy. We need to cause a scene, if you will. We need to push for this. We need to bring about change in some way. So they stayed. They wouldn't leave. They sat there in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, and they protested. Well, the communist government kind of turned a blind eye to this and just said, well, let them protest. They'll go away eventually. They'll get sick of it and they'll leave. Well, finally, after a couple weeks, they erected this statue that you see right here, the Goddess of Democracy. Okay, they erected that statue right outside of the leader's building. You see the picture of Mao Zedong right there. Huge, huge embarrassment to the Communist Party to see their citizens longing for freedom of expression and longing for freedom of speech and for democracy, and seeing the upheaval and seeing the disapproval of the communist system was really a black eye for China, and something that they weren't prepared to deal with. It's something they saw as a threat to their way of life and a threat to them maintaining power. So they knew they had to do something about it. Eventually, they brought in the military, and it got ugly real quick. Okay, they brought in the military, soldiers with guns, with tear gas, with batons. They actually brought in tanks, and they busted up the demonstration by force. Thousands and thousands of people died or were thrown in jail during the Tiananmen Square massacre. It was an absolute atrocity viewed around the world too. The whole world saw this. The whole world knew what was going on. It was a huge black eye for the Communist Party in China, for the world to see that not everyone wanted this communist system. They were not unified in their beliefs. It was really bad for the Chinese government. They wouldn't recover from that for a long time. So let's take a quick look at China currently. Alright, the Communist Party is still in control. The CPC is the only political party. There are still thousands, millions of Chinese that long and want democracy, but they just haven't been able to bring it about. The economy is no longer a command economy, like we said. It's more of a free market economy. It's by no means a free market economy, but there is more private businesses. There is some international trade. There is some private ownership within the country. They're not all making the same amount of money. The government no longer tells you what occupation you have to have. So the economy is freer, but it's still not as free as, say, the United States or India or many other Asian countries. It's still a rather oppressed economy, but it's gotten better. China's economy is one of the fastest growing in the world. Currently, it is second in the world in GDP, only to the United States, and the figures project that they will actually pass the United States within the next couple years. They rely heavily on exports to the United States. Like I've said before, look through your house and see how many items you can find that are made in China. I bet you can find 50 to 100. A lot of our consumer goods are made in China. So they really rely heavily on the United States to buy their consumer goods, and that helps their economy. Now, despite the fact that they have this massive economy, second in the world in GDP, their population, as we know, is also the largest in the world. 1.3 billion people. There are 7 billion people in the world, and 1.3 of them live in China alone. Okay, so the fact is that drags down their per capita GDP. Remember, GDP is the value of all goods and services produced in a country within a year. Per capita GDP is that number, whatever it may be, divided by the number of citizens they have. So it kind of gives you a value of the average value of goods and services produced within a year by a citizen. Okay, that number in China is low. It's 8,400. So the average Chinese citizen produces $8,400 worth of goods and services per year. That ranks 94th in the world. So their GDP, just their GDP, is second in the world, but their per capita GDP is 94th. So that's why China is actually considered a developing country, because the standard of living for the average Chinese citizen is still very, very low. One of the reasons for this is the primary industry in China is still agriculture. 50% of all jobs in China are agricultural jobs, and the agricultural jobs in China don't make a great deal of money. So China still falls on the list of that developing country category. But the interesting thing is, China is probably one of the top 5 most important economies in the world. Okay? They produce so much of what we consume and so much of what we use that if something were to happen to China's economy, it'd be disastrous for the entire world. So some say they're developed, some say they're developing. Most put them in the category of a developing country because of that $8,400 GDP, which means that on average their citizens make less than $8,400 per year. Okay, so that's kind of the state of China currently. Still one of the world's great powers, probably considered to be a superpower, massive military, a good economy overall, and they're definitely making strides from where they were during the Mao Zedong period. That's the last of our videos over China. Good luck studying tonight. If you have any questions, feel free to post them to My Big Campus. Let me just say that if you're watching this, it's good, because this information will be on the test. You're going to need to know this. Alright?